please welcome on stage also again Peter Arlett. Thank you very much.
So thanks again. Happy birthday again. Hopefully I won't repeat myself too much, but there are a few common themes from things I said in the panel discussion this morning. It's actually quite a difficult job because you may not be surprised that I was asked to submit my slides before the meeting, and yet in a way it's been pitched as a response to the meeting. Therefore, it's more actually reflections on VAC4EU and a few reflections looking forward, not directly informed by the discussion today. So, what I'd like to do is just set out this clinical evidence vision that I mentioned this morning. Some of you will have seen it before, but I think it's rather central to our thinking at the European Medicines Agency. I want to talk a little bit about real-world evidence at EMA. I want to talk about some of the guidance work. I want to talk about the place of VAC4EU studies. I won't go into that in much detail because actually a lot of the content from the slides has been presented in one form or another during the course of the day, and then conclude with some key messages, including a little look to the future. Let's start here. So some of you will have seen this published about 10 months ago. And the reference to the publication is at the bottom of the slide. The idea that we need to generate excellent clinical evidence because excellent clinical evidence is at the core of a successful marketing authorization application, including for a vaccine, and at the core of decision-making on the benefits and risks of products. We propose this cycle that starts with the patient voice, guiding every step of the way, that evidence generation should be planned, and I really emphasize that because sometimes studies are rushed into without ensuring that the decision-making on evidence generation is informed by all that has gone before, which is, so here I reference purpose, so why are we trying to generate evidence, but the data and the information and the knowledge and expertise that has gone before. So all the previous clinical trials before you start a new clinical trial, all the previous observational studies before you start a new observational study. So the research question should drive the evidence choice and not dogma. I think it's really interesting. In my mandate since 2021, I've looked after clinical trials as well as observational research, as well as spontaneous reports for human medicines. And we also have I was going to call them biotechnologists, the biostatisticians and the methodologists in the team. And it's a really nice opportunity to bridge, because I think it is true to say that people still can be rather siloed in their thinking. We had a really interesting meeting yesterday on external controls. I mentioned it earlier. And people were rather diverse in their views. Some people just didn't want to explore that there could be another option than a randomized controlled trial, as if a randomized controlled trial was always the right way to address a research question or always feasible, and of course it's not. So I think it's also true that an observational study may not be the right way to address a research question, so it works both ways. But it's a really central premise of this agenda. Clinical trials remain core to evidence generation, but they should be better, faster, and optimized. And many of you will be aware of the Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU initiative, which is trying to get faster authorization and trying to support a better European infrastructure for clinical trials. And I was struck by, is it Pierre Van Damme from Antwerp? I don't know if he's still here. There he is. We're doing a lot of work to make it better on the clinical trial side. And I was trying to convince him at lunchtime that it will get better. He's got to believe. Yeah, you've got to believe, Pierre. Thank you. Yeah. I've got a sense he's the kind of guy that will hold me to account for that comment. But it's going to get better on clinical trials. Real-world evidence, and you've seen this quote many times before. It comes from a paper we published a few years before. That real-world evidence is enabled and value is established. In other words, we need to be able to access the data. We need to have the methods in place. We need to have the networks, the VAC4EU stuff. and we need to establish its value. And this is a big program of work that we are doing, which is really heavy lifting. And that is, we go committee by committee and also to some of the other stakeholder groups, like particularly the HTA bodies, and say, what are your use cases? What are your research questions? And then we try to see if we can answer them using real-world evidence. And then we do pilot studies, proof of concepts, and we go back with the evidence. And it doesn't always work. And sometimes either our access to data is insufficient or our methods just weren't very well suited, etc. But you can't, it comes back to this word trust, which has come up time and time and time again today. In English, you conjugate trust with earn. You earn trust. You have to demonstrate that something's valuable before, you can't just go into a committee and say, you will believe in real-world evidence, and you will, because people won't. We need to establish its value in the different use cases. And the final point, which again has been a recurring theme today, high transparency underpins societal trust. And transparency is obviously a complex topic, but it could be transparency, it could be access to data, it could be on multiple levels. Now, I don't know why, because Catherine Coe helped me with these slides, but she's put the emergency task force in, and I'm going to have to say, so the emergency strengthens, so this is actually about the extended legal mandate that the EMA got in response to COVID-19. It was so you may have heard people referring to the extended mandate. It refers to ECDC and EMA, and it explicitly gave us a mandate for real-world data access and analysis and real-world evidence in the context of pandemic preparedness and response. The new pharmaceutical legislation, which we understand will be adopted into law in the first quarter next year, extends this mandate across all products. So it won't then just be in pandemic preparedness and response. And although it's been implicit that we can do it as a regulator, or initiate real-world evidence generation as a regulator, it's really useful for it to be explicit. It's useful from a data protection point of view, in terms of getting funding, in terms of aligning people, and so on. So I would argue we don't need the legal mandate, but it's very useful to have it. Now, this slide is it looks unbalanced, and the reason it looks unbalanced is the only way you could get the Darwin data partners on was to give it 2/3 of the slide. Start on the right hand, on the 1/3 of the slide. So I just want to mention that we procure, and this is how we have funded VAC4EU and some of the related studies, we procure studies through what we call framework contracts. So we have contracts in place with a number of different consortia, and it then allows us, when we have a specific research question, to give then a specific contract to do that piece of work. And it has been, so we've got 8 research organizations and academic institutions, including VAC4EU. This has given us access to 60 data sources in 20 countries, and is there a number there? No, there isn't. But these contracts give us the capacity for secondary use of healthcare data and primary data collection. We have gone through public procurement this year, and before the end of 2026, we anticipate having signed a new set of framework contracts. So I'm not involved in that procedure, although I'll be the person that signs it off. So I don't have visibility on the different organizations, but I would guess some of the organizations will be the same and some of them will be new. And hopefully it will further strengthen our ability to do bespoke studies in response to complex research questions. Now, the reason the 2/3 of the slide is on Darwin, as I mentioned, is only so we could get the data partners in. It hasn't been much mentioned today. It is, but Jean-Michel Donnier said something that I want to echo, and that is that it is complementary to what is going on within the framework contracts and what's going on within VAC4EU. I believe Darwin will do more vaccine-related studies going forward. I do believe that it can't, however, using the common data model approach it's got at the moment, answer all the same questions that some of our framework contractors can. For example, the work on pregnancy, I think, is rather unique and requires a different approach, just as an example. Just in terms of Darwin, 30 data partners as of last February. By the end of February this year, we are expecting to have about 40 data partners. Currently, it's 16 European countries, access to data from 180 million patients. We don't think we will quite reach 100 studies this year. This is initiated. It's probably more likely to be 80, but again, next year, 80, 90, 100 studies through Darwin. Many of these are relatively straightforward studies. They may be more about drug utilization and less about some of the complex questions that have been posed through VAC4EU, which is why I say it's complementary. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail on this, but it was mentioned, was it Rebecca Chandler mentioned the importance of genetics in vaccine safety. This is Darwin here, but we do have 2 biobanks in Darwin. We've only done 1 pharmacogenomics study so far, and it was on statins and muscle disorders, which you would have thought would be at the easy end of the spectrum. But what we found is despite the fact that we've got the UK biobank with 500,000 individuals and the Estonian biobank with 200,000 individuals, it still wasn't really powered enough to give us precise results. So that's an interesting learning. But the promise, if we can get more genomics data linked to electronic health records, is huge, particularly in terms of looking for genetic predispositions to adverse events, for example. Now, this has been mentioned a couple of times. This is the practical output of that extended legal mandate that I referred to earlier. It's called the Vaccine Monitoring Platform. It is, by law, a partnership between ECDC and the European Medicines Agency. And the role is to identify and prioritize evidence gaps, to coordinate independent post-authorization studies, and we use our existing mechanisms. So that would be Darwin, that would be the framework contracts, that would be VEBIS for ECDC, or whatever replaces those when the procurement cycles renew. So the framework contracts would be then our new framework contracts. We get at EMA 5 million a year as EMA. I think ECDC is either 7 or 8 million a year to do vaccine post-authorization studies. That doesn't mean we can't spend more, but that's, if you like, ring-fenced funding, which should be spent on vaccine studies, or I would have to justify why it wasn't. And we have a steering group for the vaccine monitoring platform, which I co-chair on behalf of EMA. And on the other side of the slide, you can see the Immunisation and Vaccine Monitoring Board. Xavier, this is going quite well, you'll be pleased to hear, because we had a predecessor to the Immunisation and Vaccine Monitoring Board, which was kind of heavy lifting, I think, wasn't it, Xavier, in its day? But this now is running quite well. We've got a meeting in Stockholm in either November or December. We'll be reviewing our research agenda, getting inputs on priorities for research, as well as some advice on the way research is conducted. And this is made up, as you can see from the people images, with regulatory experts from EMA committees. Jean-Michel is a member. He's also a member of the ETF. I think it was said during his introduction. You've then got particularly national focal points from the EU Public Health Authority. So this is, if you like, the existing ECDC network of public health bodies who are critical in the or can be critical in the conduct of research. So I'll go very quickly through this slide. If you look at the research areas that the VMP has looked at or is looking at, you can see evidence gaps on authorized vaccines. I mean, it's the obvious things that you would expect: special populations, additional endpoints that weren't in the clinical trials, long-term effectiveness and safety. Benefit risk monitoring when there's a change in vaccine composition, complementary knowledge on known concerns. So the example given here is myocarditis with messenger RNA vaccines. We've also used the vaccine monitoring platform to endorse work, for example, when new indication for the smallpox vaccine was added for Mpox, and we used, if you like, the funding and some of that pot of money to fund studies. In some countries, it was called an observational study. In other countries, it was called a clinical trial, but generated evidence on safety and effectiveness of the vaccines. In terms of preparedness, we've done work. We're looking at vaccines in development or undergoing regulatory review, which are likely to come onto the market. And so there we might do work on burden of disease, background incidence rates, of adverse events of special interests, as well as more foundational work relating to new platforms. There is interest in potentially doing work on communications through the vaccine monitoring platform. Maybe that's something that we can think about further based on some of the outcomes of today's meeting. Now, just a nod to some of the international work. So, I don't want to, it's the last time I'm going to mention your name, Xavier, but I think Xavier should be given credit as one of the key rapporteurs for the EU reflection paper on the use of real-world data in non-interventional studies to generate real-world evidence for regulatory purposes. And what's interesting there, and it was a very, very recurrent theme at our external controls workshop yesterday, was target trial emulation as an approach. This does appear to be gaining a lot of traction in terms of a design approach. On the right-hand side, you can see ICH M14, which is the guideline on, if you like, pharmacoepidemiology, real-world evidence for safety studies, recently adopted. And obviously, this is complemented by some of the good pharmacovigilance practices in the EU. Just to complement that, and these have been mentioned today, and in fact, many members of the VAC4EU consortium were involved in the work that led to these catalogues of real-world data sources and studies. And so it's a very nice piece of work, and we think these are really useful tools in terms of discoverability of data and transparency of research. This point about transparency is really interesting. In the EU now, all clinical trial protocols have to be registered, and all studies, you need a summary set of results submitted into the clinical trials information system. It all goes public. There is no such legal requirement for observational research, with a little niche, which is studies that we impose on the companies. This is voluntary, and good practice would determine that both academia and industry and anyone performing such studies should be putting them into the register. Interestingly, there's a little bit of global competition between study registries, particularly clinicaltrials.gov. There's this new ISPOR, were there 3 or 4 studies registered in the ISPOR? Not ISPOR, ISPI one, last time I blinked. I'm being slightly sarcastic, because but those are really nice for transparency and for discoverability. EMA's data quality framework applies to all data that might be used in medicines regulation, and we are finalizing a kind of deep dive application to real-world data. There's some really nice pieces of work. I have to say it's gained much more traction than I thought it would. When we came up with the original data quality framework, I thought it was a bit academic, but it seems that across industry and academia, people are taking it very seriously and see it as a useful tool so that we're all speaking a common language when it comes to understanding what we mean by data quality. Because you speak to stakeholders about real-world evidence, real-world data, they always say, oh, my greatest concern is quality, data quality. And then you ask what they mean by that, and you can get 1,000 different answers as to what they understand by the term data quality. Methods guide, the NSET methods guide, there'll be a substantive update on the vaccine chapter in 2026, I'm told. You've got building transparency and reproducibility in practice of pharmacoepidemiology and outcomes research. So there's a number of consensus documents, of which we've highlighted one there. Now, this is the slides that I'm not going to go through in detail, but what I wanted to say as a headline is that VAC4EU has made a substantial contribution to our preparedness and our response to pandemics, and continues to do so. So access the early cohort event monitoring, then the follow-on cohort event monitoring, rapid safety assessments of specific vaccines using electronic health records, the work in the non-Nordic countries of the COVID-19 effectiveness. And then if we go here, we've got the Safety VAC project, which is more preparedness, if you like, and relates across different vaccines, so it's not just COVID. I'm not going to repeat because it's been in many of the presentations before, but this has become, if you like, part of the foundation, part of the bedrock. So we need VAC VAC4EU to continue and to further strengthen some of the data points and the timeliness points that we were mentioning earlier, reaching out to ever more data partners as they become available and governance and quality and so on are in place. There's some really interesting work going on through a collaboration called ICMRA, International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. ICMRA has been going for about 10 years now and is an informal collaboration between regulators around the world. It was mainly for strategic collaboration, but there's a few parts that are now a little bit more operational, and this is one example. So we set up a working group, and EMA co-chaired it with Health Canada back at the beginning of the COVID pandemic to do observational studies on the COVID-19 vaccines. I think Conception as a project contributed to some of that work. And when the COVID pandemic was resolving, we asked ourselves the question, well, do we just let that collaboration die, or do we find a more useful follow-on? And what we've now done is set up a follow-up working group, if you like, which is looking at public health preparedness and response more generally. And we've got 16 agencies and WHO collaborating. The idea is, if you like, you hear people talk about ever-warm networks of clinical trials. The idea is that this is an ever-warm collaboration between international regulators. If I was going to tell you what happened with the COVID studies, we got some really interesting results about a year or two late, yes? So the idea is that we might get studies when they're more impactful on decision-making by having in place governance and ongoing collaboration with Health Canada and hopefully the US and so on and so forth. Well, you've got the list there: Envisa, EMA, Health Canada, Singapore, MHRA, Saudi, WHO, for example. So really quite a nice piece of work. Patrice Verpiat, head of real-world evidence at EMA, is co-chairing from the EMA side with Health Canada. So we are reporting on what we are doing. So this is a screenshot on the left-hand side from our last annual report on the real-world evidence of EMA-initiated studies. Clearly, it's not all real-world evidence studies being done, but it's quite important. It's quite a large amount of work. It's quite an important amount of work, and it's novel because if you go back 10 years, regulators weren't really initiating studies. And so I think we're being very transparent on learnings and so on. It's quite an interesting time. We will be going to our management board in December with a bit of a stock take on our real-world evidence work. And the reason for that is that the current Darwin EU framework will run until February 2027. So that's a blink of an eye away, actually. And so probably end of first quarter next year, we will procure for whatever may come after Darwin EU, and we should make sure that's informed by learnings of what we've done. And this is the bedrock of what we've been learning. Just for your interest, the article is not from the Regulatory Network in Europe, but it's a hook to tell you that we are currently working to analyse the real-world evidence that's been submitted in dossiers for vaccines in detail based on internal documents, and that will lead to a publication, I guess, in 2026. And that could be quite interesting in terms of informing drug development, vaccine development, and prioritisation amongst stakeholders. So I've got 2 slides left. This is key messages, which I wrote before the presentations today and the discussion. Excellent clinical evidence is at the core of decision-making. Reliable and relevant vaccine real-world evidence builds on fit-for-purpose real-world data in line with good practice and guidelines. VAC4EU studies have been added to the body of evidence supporting benefit-risk of COVID-19 vaccines and continue to support readiness for monitoring both licensed and novel vaccines. We believe that VAC4EU has a very important part to play going forward. We need to expand, we are expanding vaccine use cases. We've got the new framework contracts coming up before the end of the year, and then we will be doing a big piece of procurement next year for Darwin EU. Excellent real-world evidence will inform patients and healthcare professionals and ultimately support vaccine confidence. It was a point that came out over and over again. It's not just about good communication, it's good communication on top of good evidence. And then finally, collaboration and cross-fertilization are key. That's not my last slide, this is my last slide. I thought it would be fun to just pretend that I could look into the future, okay? So this is, I've called it vaccine clinical evidence because some of it's a bit ambiguous as to whether it's entirely observational or maybe a little bit observationally clinical trially. I'm not sure those are words in the English dictionary, by the way. But I came up with 4 points. Firstly, and again, it's been a theme, and I was very pleased that Maria Dutart was here talking about the role of the patient. And I actually stole some of these ideas from a similar concept on clinical trials, which is what made me think about the bridge between the two. So citizens should be central to our decision-making and our planning. So it's not quite the same as a patient engagement on a clinical trial, but we should be informed about what matters to the people that are going to receive these vaccines. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Evidence co-created is a bit strong there, but I'm just trying to push us in a direction where we would more systematically talk to panels of patients or citizens. Multi-stakeholder collaboration, again, it's been recurrent, and it's whenever we talk about real-world evidence in a multi-stakeholder forum, everybody likes to say, well, multi-stakeholder collaboration is very important, isn't it? But I think it is. Better collaboration will facilitate better data access, will facilitate better methods, and therefore generation of better evidence. So I think it is a key ingredient along with the patient or the citizen voice. Innovation enabled covers a multitude of things. So I do believe data access, the availability of data will go up and up and up unless we have a catastrophe of governance, like a new data protection regulation that says you can't ever share data or something. I don't think that's happening. If anything, the tide seems to be going slightly in the other direction to be through EHGS, for example, in terms of enabling data access. We need to make the most of the European health data space, and I won't repeat the kind of call to arms that I made earlier. Networks like VAC4EU should be further strengthened and will strengthen evidence generation. We will get novel vaccines, including not just against infectious agents, but more and more against cancers, for example. And it's one little bullet point on a busy slide, but AI is going to change everything. And we had some really nice examples on the primary data collection bit today, but we haven't really started talking about data management and all those other things. I'm going to be a bit self-indulgent now. Your discussion about making data access through HDS in the last panel, my brain was just going AI, because it's not so much that the humans getting the data are going to then publish bad papers. I mean, it's so easy to put a chunk of data into an algorithm and it turns a beautiful, convincing sounding paper, particularly if you don't know what you're talking. I'm an early bird. I get the 6 o'clock train to Amsterdam every morning, and in the tsunami of emails that has arrived overnight, there's almost always, please review this article, and it's looking at the air. They're always looking at the AIR's US adverse event data. And I assume they're AI generated. I always say no, obviously. It's just a couple more clicks on my journey. But if you make data very widely available, some people will churn out papers based on AI, and there will be almost no thinking has gone into it. So anyway, AI will change everything. That's my point. And hopefully we can make some of that for the better. Last point, better data and better evidence. This is a general point about, I suppose, transparency in a way, but transparency in the broader sense, making data available. It's the positive side to what I've just said. If we can make data and evidence more available to patients and to citizens and to decision makers in a form that allows them to make good decisions, then they'll make good decisions most of the time. I stole the idea from the clinical trials side. Some of you will be aware we released earlier this year something called Trial Map. So we've got all of our public data on clinical trials that are enrolling in the EU and put it into a Google Map type thing. I don't know if you should have a look at it. Trial Map, you could Google EMA Trial Map, and you can just scroll in and go and find and you can search by a particular indication and find out whether there's an enrolling trial local to you. I mean, it's beautiful, and it's so simple. And all of a sudden, patients are empowered to actually, because it's got the contact details for the principal investigator, are empowered to inquire as to whether they might enroll in a clinical trial. just by availability of data and information. So that's the kind of concept that I'm trying to catch bottom right. So finally, as has been said repeatedly, there will be further epidemics and pandemics. We must collaborate to strengthen the foundation for clinical evidence, generational evidence, and therefore be prepared. And I think that really is my last slide. So thank you very much indeed.